Hi everyone, I'm Veronica Royo from Itasca. Thank you for joining our first webinar on our software applications. So this webinar will be presented by Mrs. Rima Ghazal, who is a geotechnical engineer in Itasca, France for 5 years. She will be providing today an explanation on how to use bounding block in 3D software. Questions are welcome. So if you have any questions, please wait for the end of the presentation. Rima will open all the microphones and you will just need to unmute your own microphone before talking. Now I'll give the floor to Rima.
Hello everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar. Today I will talk to you about bonded block modeling in 3D, which is a novel technique in 3D software to model propagation of crack and the fragmentation in rock masses. So, what is bonded block modeling? First, I will talk to you about what is a bonded block model. In fact, it's just simply an association of tetrahedral blocks at a small scale in 3D, where the blocks are elastic and the contacts between the blocks are elastic plastic, so the failure can occur only at the contacts between blocks. So why do we need to use bonded block modeling? We know that the behavior of rock masses depend on the properties of the rock, of the fractures, and of the in situ stresses. What we most commonly know is shear failure through the rock mass or through the joints. When we can consider the rock mass as a continuum, we usually use continuum models, continuum software such as FLAC3D, or when we can also homogenize the rock mass, such in this case. When we have discontinuities in the rock mass and behavior characterized by falling wedges, for example, we use discontinuum software such as 3D. In other situations, when we have massive to moderately fractured rock mass, so a rock mass with a high GSI and relatively high in situ stresses, we can have failure in the form of tensile cracking in low confinement zones, as you can see here. And those failure mechanisms cannot be taken into account using continuum models and using failure criteria such as Hook and Brown. So this is where BBM modeling comes to fill the gap, because it will permit to model crack initiation and propagation in rock masses, and so to model mechanisms such as spalling and brittle failure around excavations. So just before starting, I give you some examples of application. Here we see, for example, the fragmentation due to spalling mechanisms around a deep excavation. Here we see also, this is a model of a cave back with fragments forming at the cave back and propagating. And we can also use BBM to perform UCS test on samples, which allows us usually to reproduce high values of UCS to tensile strength ratios. So today I will start by telling you how to generate a BBM sample, how to implement it in a larger 3D model, how to assess fragmentation, and then I'll show you an application of using BBM. So a bonded block sample can be generated inside 3D by first forming a mesh, a tetrahedral mesh, and then using this command list zone poly to transform this mesh into a polyhedral blocks. So this export the mesh into a text file, then we can import it again in the form of blocks. However, when we have to model large samples, it is faster to do it externally, and thus we can use brittle software, which is the Itasca meshing software. Here, identically to before, we do a tetrahedral meshing, and then we export this mesh, and 3DEC will import it into blocks. When we do a BBM sample, we, as you see here, we have stacked blocks at the boundary with so aligned edges. So for the modeling, it's better to cut those boundaries. So we add joints like this, and we remove the boundaries to obtain something less uniform on the boundaries of our sample. We can also introduce to our BBM sample fractures, so larger scale fracture than what already exists between the blocks, and thus we can use the DFN module in 3DEC. So this is an example of a DFN generated in 3DEC with these commands. And so in colors, I have put the BBM sample. So this is a cut view before cutting with the DFN and after cutting. So in this way, we have, let's say, two scales of fractures, what already exists between the blocks, and the larger scale fractures that represent the open features or the fractures that explicitly exist in the rock mass. Then we have to implement this sample into a larger model. In fact, if we want to excavate into, do an excavation into a BBM, we cannot do the whole model using a BBM because it will be computationally hard. We will put the BBM in the region where we are supposed to have the most of the perturbation. So the BBN will be implemented inside an elastic continuous boundary. For example, for this case where we have an excavation into a tunnel, or for this case where we have an excavation representing the cave back in a cave mine. So the elastic boundary will permit to have a proper stress shedding into the model. The properties of this boundary should be chosen so to match those of the BBM sample. And so to have this, we can perform UCS test on BBM samples and deduce the macroscopic elastic properties and apply them to this boundary. Then concerning the context between the blocks of the bounded block model, we can either use constant properties, but it is more realistic to use for the strengths a distribution of properties. So we can perfectly do this with 3DEC. For example, this is a distribution, cumulative distribution of the cohesion properties of the vein, and this is a cut view showing you that we can have at the same time very weak veins in blue and very strong veins in the model in black. And so what I mean by veins is in fact the contact between the blocks, between my BBM blocks. When we apply some perturbation to our model, we can have the formation of fragments. So what is a fragment? It is an association of blocks bonded together and separated from the rest by failed contacts, either failed contacts or open features. I mean by this pre-existing cohesionless joints. So fragments can be computed by those simple commands. They can be put into different groups so that the user can visualize them with different colors. So every color here represents a fragment. They can be also written into a text file with information on their ID number and their volume. And then when we have this information of the volume, we can do some statistical tests, some statistical information about those fragments. So here I show you what are the different types of fragments in a simulation. If we already have cohesionless joints in the model, before performing any sort of perturbation or excavation, we initially can have what I call in situ fragments formed by open joints in the model. Then when we excavate this region, for example, we have additional fragments due to the breakage of the BBM that is located between those joints. So you see here that everything seems to be fragmented, but then to identify between the fragments that are stable and those that will collapse, we can use criteria, for example, based on the stresses on the mean stress in the model. This is what we did here. So we consider that the collapsed fragments that will actually fall out of the rock mass are those having low mean stress. This video shows the fragmentation process. So first we have initial in situ fragments in the model, and then progressively we will have a first failure along open joints, large-scale joints, and progressively rock bridges failing and cracking between those joints, which is allowed with the BBM model. And so we can have crack initiation and propagation in this model. So like I said previously, we can do some statistics on the fragments and, for example, assess the V50, which is the percentage of volume passing, which is represent the 50th percentile, or we can also assess the percentage of volumes higher than a certain number. So now I will present to you results of an application that we have done here at Itasca on cave mining. This is a model that represents a caving below a BBM sample that represents the ore body. So it's a slice of infinite model in the y direction. We have this an elastic boundary and fixed displacement in the y direction to simulate infinite condition. This is a zoom on the BBM sample and the excavation that we are going to perform. We have high in situ stresses with a high ratio between horizontal and vertical stress. The excavation is performed by progressively relaxing in a nonlinear way the boundary forcing, the initial boundary forces that are applied on this excavation before excavating. So we release progressively the initial forces. This is a zoom on our BBM sample. So we have bonded blocks with a spacing of 0.5 meters. And on top of this, we have a very simple discrete fracture network with spacing which is named here joint block spacing. And these fractures are characterized by a certain persistence. So we have performed a parametric study taking into account all these parameters, but today I'm gonna focus mainly on the effect of the strength of the contacts between the blocks, bonded blocks, so the veins, and also on the effect of the discrete fracture network, so on the persistency of the discrete fracture network. So first, if we don't have initial large-scale fracture in the model, we only have veins. What is the effect of the strength of those veins? When the so the C is the cohesion. When the strength diminishes, we have naturally more fragments, but we also have a decrease in the fragment size. If we add to a BBM model a discrete fracture network, we have an increase also in the volume of fragmentation and a decrease in the fragment size. On the other side, if we are dealing with weak veins, the discrete fracture adding DFN on our sample can increase the volume of collapse, but it does not have a significant effect on the fragment size, because the fragment size is more determined by the initial size of the bonded blocks. So here I represent again this on the chart, the 50th percentile with the in the y direction, and here is the in the x direction the persistency of my DFN. So in green, these are the weakest veins. We don't have an effect on the DFN on the size of the fragments. Then when we increase progressively the strength, so here in blue we have increased the cohesion of the veins, we have larger fragments, and we start seeing the effect of the DFN on the fragment size. And so on. For larger cohesions, we have larger veins, and here we see the effect of the DFN with smaller fragments when we add when the persistency increases. So the BBM tool is an efficient numerical tool to model brittle failure and spalling mechanisms in deep underground excavations around the excavation, so in low confinement zones, because it permits to model properly the crack initiation and propagation, and also the evaluation of fragments formation. We can combine BBM and DFN in the same model. This will permit to account for failure inside the rock mass through the failure between the BBM blocks, but also account for failure through pre-existing larger scale fractures in the model. The BBM was used in this project to make design charts for cave miners to help them assess primary fragmentation in their cave mines, which can help them to in the design of their of their caving. And finally, we can also combine BBM, add to a BBM model structural elements such as rock bolts with, for example, hybrid bolts having allowing shear resistance, allowing to model the shear resistance between fractures. So this is all for today. Here is a list of publications if you want to have more information on the subject. So thank you for listening, and if you have questions or comments, you can send to my email written here.
And yes, this is Veronique. And if you have questions, you can just unmute your microphone now.
Hello, I'm Christian.
Hello.
I would like to know. I understand that in this presentation to the assessment of fragmentation, this methodology is highly dependent of the zone size. No, when you transform these zones
in
into.
fact, I cannot hear you very well. Can you repeat?
So my question is about the zone size dependency. When you are just building the BBM.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So, did you try different zone size? How you deal with this zone size dependency when you are assessing the fragmentation of a caving mine?
So your
did you do it like?
So your question is about the size of the block tetrahedra that I'm using in my sample.
Exactly.
Yes. In fact, in our particular application here, we used 0.5 meters because, in fact, we had some data from the field that showed that we had veins in the rock that have a spacing of around this value. But of course, for other projects, parameter study should be made by changing this value. But it's sure that relatively small values should be used to be able to properly model the propagation of cracks.
So let me understand. So you used 5 meter block.
0.5 meters.
0.5.
0.5, yes.
Okay. So your smallest block in your fragmentation assessment is 0.5.
Yes, it's the smallest possible fragment. Let's say it's the smallest fragment, but you can have larger fragments.
And did you see some dependency of this parameter, or?
For this particular example, we have not tested changing the edge length of our sample because it was a feed data somehow.
Okay, and just last quick question. How long took this model with 0.5 block size in the runtime?
It depends, in fact, on the let's say the volume of your model, the size, and also on how you do it. If you do progressive relaxation of the boundary and so on.
So how long took your model?
It can take few hours to have a result.
3 hours.
Few hours.
Okay.
For the example I showed, which is a slice, kind of slice of a larger model.
Okay, thanks.
Any other question?
Hi, this is Yuan Li. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I joined the meeting in the middle because of the wrong link. I'm wondering if you can share the recorded of this seminar.
Yes.
I can.
This webinar is recorded, so you will be able to visualize the video after the webinar. You will receive a link of the recording.
Okay, great. You will send us a link to the recorded.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's all.
Hi, this is Subhash.
Hello.
My question is, you mentioned about the persistence of the rock.
Yes.
So how do you define your persistence in the model? And would it be possible to share the material properties that you used for your model, for instance, the peak and residual friction angles for your contacts?
Yes. In fact, here it was a particular study where we wanted to do a parametric study for like to say for research reasons. So we have put a very simple fracture network like you see here. If I prolongate all the fractures, you will have like a square fractures with identical spacing. This is what I call the joint block spacing. So, and I consider that my persistence is in fact, if it's 100%, then all is continuous here. And if it's, for example, 50%, then 50% of the surfaces that are supposed to be filled with those fractures are empty. So this is how we define this persistency here. And for the friction of the veins, here we chose 40 degrees. Did I reply to your questions?
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Any other question? Okay, so we thank you all for your participation. As I said, this webinar has been recorded and the video will be available online in a couple of days. It will also be sent to you by email. So if you have any questions, you can contact Rima Ghazal by email. Also, you will be informed of the next webinars that should be given in the following months. So thank you again, and we wish you all a good day.
Thank you all for joining us today, and see you soon, hopefully.
Sorry, I have a question just before you leave.
Yeah,
just thought about it.
Of course.
I'm sorry. It's Sebastian speaking. Your last slide regarding the conclusions where you showed that the rock bolts. I'm not sure I understood that what you were saying. Isn't it already possible to add bolts into 3-deck? And I'm just not sure.
Yes, of course, it's possible to add the bolts into 3-deck and also into a bonded block model. But here what I wanted to say also, it's about the hybrid bolts, which will be a new feature in the next 3-deck, which will have, with this, we will have the possibility to take into account the shear failure, the shear behavior in a section of a bolt, which will permit to model the resistance to fracture shear displacement. So this is the hybrid bolt tool. But in fact, you can already now use classical cables in 3-deck.
Okay, and what release will that be of 3-deck? Is it the latest one, or is it upcoming like in 1 year?
Sorry, you mean the bolts are
3-deck version
present in the current version 5.2.
It is in the 5.2?
Yeah, we already have bolts in 5.2 version, yes.
But the hybrid bolts?
The hybrid bolts, in fact, it's already available, but let's say not to everyone, but it will be released with the next version 3-deck 7. Normally it should be here in 2020.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Have a good day all.